In previous videos, we looked at Security Gateway's logging and reporting functionality, as well as the archive function. Today I want to focus in a bit more detail about spam, and specifically how users as well as administrators can manage the spam that gets through to their own users' quarantine folders. So Security Gateway has a lot of built-in security features to stop spam arriving, and majority of the spam that is attempted to get through to users will be rejected. However, there's always a selection of spam that's kind of borderline, where messages could be considered spam to some people but may not to others, more sort of marketing type email. And those messages, rather than being rejected outright, by default will end up in the user's quarantine folders. So I want to start by looking at the quarantine. So if we go into the message and queues section of Security Gateway, and we can look at user quarantine folder here. So we're logged in as an administrator at the moment, and we're looking at all of the users' quarantine folders first. So there's multiple different users here that are represented. And these are all the messages that Security Gateway hasn't yet delivered to those end users. It's kept it in quarantine, waiting for an action to be taken by either the admin or the users themselves. So I can select a message in the list, and I can view that message if I want to look at its contents. And indeed, if there's images that are linked, like there's a linked image there, I can click on the banner to show the whole message, and I can make the decision whether or not I think this message should have been delivered to the end user. So I can release that message, and then that will now come out of the quarantine and be delivered to the end user. Or if we select a few messages we know are definitely spam, we can choose to delete them up here with delete selected messages. Or indeed, if we're happy that the quarantine only contains spam, we can delete all messages. Now this works very well, but in a typical scenario of 10, 15, 20 users, it's quite possible that this quarantine may have many hundreds of messages over a few days, and that can be a little bit laborious for an administrator to run through, trying to make the decision of whether or not those spam messages for their end users. So it's nice to be able to give some of that task over to the end users themselves, and Security Gateway does that by sending quarantine summary emails to the end users. So let's have a look at the actual settings for the quarantine summaries. They're under Setup Users, Mail Configuration, Quarantine Configuration. So the default option is to hold all messages into the quarantine, and then send out a report email to the end users at a set time period. And I think by default it's once a day, but you can choose to send that out more often if you prefer, maybe every few hours. And that might be useful if you've got a lot of emails coming into an office throughout the day, and users are complaining that they're not seeing messages and they've been quarantined. It may be that it's a good idea to send out a quarantine summary early in the morning, maybe once again at lunch, and then later on in the afternoon, just to cover those time periods where emails have arrived. You're not waiting for the next day to get the next summary. You can sort the quarantine summary emails, so it's a little bit easier to find messages. You can do it based on time, from, or subject. And alternatively, you can, if you prefer to not have quarantine messages, you can have them delivered to end users and tag those messages with certain subject headers or specific mail headers if required. And then it's down to the client to filter them and maybe put them into junk folders, or just allow users to sort of spot spam in their inbox and decide what to do with it accordingly. Personally, I prefer to use the quarantine rather than deliver them to the end users, but there are certain scenarios where people might want to do that instead. So you can also decide whether you want to allow the users to manage their own quarantine folders, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. And there is also an administrative quarantine that, again, we'll look at in a different video. So the quarantine summaries are sent out. What do they actually look like for end users? So if I just switch here to Outlook, and I'll open up this latest quarantine summary that this user's received. So here's an example of what you would expect to see as a user. You get a nice table of the messages when they were received, the sender, subject, and it makes it quite quick and easy to sort of spot messages that you think, oh, and actually I'm missing that message, and I can release that myself. So I can just select on, let's say, pick a message down here. And what that does is that logs into Security Gateway as a one-time logging, effectively, a unique ID. So there's no requirement for the user to remember the username and password at this stage, and it releases that one message. So it's just telling me, yes, that's been successfully released, and I can close that session. And as you can see, that message has now arrived in that user's mailbox, as the prompt has popped up to tell me. So if we go into Outlook again, and we look in the mailbox, you can see it's just been delivered as normal. Now alternatively, if we go back to the report, if a user sort of sees this list of quarantine messages and thinks, no, all of this is spam, I don't want any of this message, what can I do with them? Well, I can either delete all of the messages, and then that clears out this user's quarantine. That's good practice, because otherwise every time they receive a quarantine summary, they're going to see the same messages and a few new ones on the end. So it's a good idea to get users used to deleting all of the messages. Or I can go and manually log in to the quarantine and view them as a user, which we'll do in a minute. Or indeed, if I want to, I might consider, well, that's always going to be spam, so I can flag those messages as spam. Or I can always allow specific senders, so I can effectively whitelist those senders if I'm commonly getting similar emails being picked up in the quarantine. So yeah, let's have a quick look at the quarantine login for this particular user. Okay, so if we log in as a user account, we can see that we've got the usual statistics about this user's mailbox, but we can also view their quarantine up at the top, and we can see what it currently contains and do all of the same functions: view messages, release them or delete them, or even flag them as spam or whitelist and blacklist if required. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of what the quarantine features in Security Gateway are all about, and how users can take care of their own spam messages that are on the borderline between messages that they maybe do want to receive or not. Be sure to check out our other videos on Security Gateway, where we cover all of the key features of the product.